Most people, when you talk about Iron Age shields, think of metal objects with a shiny metal front or a boss in the middle that's metal or metal edging. But in 2015, in a field near Leicester, that all changed. Hi, I'm Sophia Adams. I'm curator of the Iron Age collections. Welcome to my corner. So we know there were shields in the Iron Age, in Britain and in Europe, but we have very few of them, and those we do have, they have shiny bronze fronts on them, or they have an iron boss. They have metal edges. You might be familiar with the Battersea Shield, or the Chertsey Shield, the Witham Shield. These are all beautiful bronze objects, but all of them have got metal components. But it wasn't until 2015 we discovered this wasn't always the case. In a field just outside Leicester, was found a shield like none other found before. Not in Britain, not in Europe, not in the Northern Hemisphere. This was a shield made entirely of organic material, of bark. Now this isn't the original. The original is very delicate. It's not quite complete, but we had to recreate it so we could understand what had been found. It was found lying in the bottom of a pit, a very damp pit, so that it could preserve these organic materials. And it was upside down. And the archaeologists from University of Leicester Archaeological Services carefully cleaned away the soil and revealed a thin layer of wood and half of a handle. The bark itself was only about 3 millimetres thick. It's quite incredible that the archaeologists didn't scrape through it. But they didn't know what it was. Perhaps it was the lid to a barrel or something. So they carefully excavated round and lifted it, and then in the laboratories, the other side was excavated down through the silty layers and revealed this bit. This is the key. It's the boss. And the boss shows that this was a shield, because you don't need a boss on a lid, but you do need one on a shield, because when you hold the handle, your fist goes around the handle. You need space for it to sit protected. You can also use the boss as a weapon in its own right. The body, this part of the shield, that's made of willow bark. If you look, if I turn it over, you can see this is the outside of the tree. You've got the rough texture of the bark. And we know that the shield was made like this because we can see this rough texture on the original one. And then the smooth inner face of the bark is at the front. You can only harvest willow bark at certain times of year, so between about sort of March and June. And it's amazing, as you cut around and prise the bark off the tree, put your hand between the tree and the bark, it's really damp behind. And this is quite a sort of flexible material at first. It feels almost spongy. Now you want to keep it quite damp while you work it, because as soon as it dries out, it starts to shrink and close. Eventually you do want the shield to dry. If you dry it too quickly, it'll twist and buckle. If you dry it too slowly with something pressed against it, it goes mouldy. When the original was made, it was perhaps hung from the rafters in a round house so that the smoke off the fire could help stop it rotting and also help it slowly dry. So this is the little piece of bark off a willow tree. If you look at it in the section, you can see it's quite thick, it's kind of spongy in the middle, and it wants to curl around the tree. So what we've done, and what the Iron Age people did, was bend this the opposite way. And this is something that we had to make sense of. How did they get the tree to bend, or the bark to bend in the way it didn't want to? And why were there all these different elements to the original shield? One thing you can't really see, but you might be able to make out in the light. You see we've got some ridges here and here, 4 of them. These are quite surprising. They managed to insert through the layers of the bark, to stiffen the bark, laths, sticks. Smoothed down, these made from crabapple, and pushed into the layers while it's still damp, pushed through, thereby reinforcing the shield itself. Now we weren't sure why those were there. Was it to make the shield stronger? Was it to help shape it? And they seem to have worked both ways. One is to help it stopping it curving the wrong way, rolling up when it's drying. The other makes it a bit stronger again, helps to reinforce. And if you remember, we've got to try and fit these laths through these laminated layers of bark. So you need to have it quite damp while you do that. Most important is the boss. And that's made of basketry. It's a willow rod, spiralled round, it's called the foundation rod, and stitched over with stitches made from lime bast, which is the inside of the bark of a lime tree. Stitching all around and then attaching it to this body made of the bark of the willow tree. And then they also found along the edge a small segment of wood. This is what we call the rim. Now we're familiar with these rims from metal edge shields where you have a metal rim going around. We've never seen one with a wooden rim. And this is made of hazel. So you take a round stick of hazel, so a nice thin branch, split it in half, and then you get one flat surface, one curved surface. And then that can be bent around, while it's fresh, can be bent around the edge of the shield and attached with these stitches. We've got evidence on the original shield of some of these stitches still surviving, and they seem to be in groups, so that's how we've worked this out. Groups of maybe 4 stitches. This lime bast is an amazing material. To extract this, you take the bark off a lime tree. It's much thinner than the willow bark, and you make a little cut and bend it, and you can peel away this inner fibre. And then you want to heat and soak this to make it flexible. And then you can peel it into little strips. And when you have long strips, like here, ones we made earlier, you can then twist them and combine them together. Now, I'm not the best at this, but if you can see here, where it's been twisted and around itself and over, twisted around itself and over, you make a cord that's really, really strong. And that you can use for the stitches for attaching the boss and for the stitches for attaching the handle. And then the stitches around the edge, they seem to have just used the flat fibres, perhaps with a bone tool to break through the body of the shield itself so that you could stitch around. And then the handle, this is another type of wood here called poplar. And that was carefully shaped. And the useful thing about the shape of the handle, where it's kind of chamfered, gave us an idea that the shield did curve back towards the body of the person holding it. So it did curve away from the shape it wanted to go. We've also added some extra little features on here which were not found in the original, but we were wondering might have been useful. And these are these little pins. And these little pins are made from hawthorn thorns. And we do have evidence of hawthorn being used, various things at this time. And we have evidence on the metal shields of little pins on the rim. On the original shield, we can see tiny little scratches across, dividing up the space. And it looks like these little scratches have been designed for decoration. So this is a suggestion of how the pattern of the design would have looked. So red ochre marking out some areas, and then the natural paler colour of the bark itself contrasting with that. So it's a much more geometric pattern than, again, we're familiar with from Iron Age shields. The Battersea shield has all swirling designs. So it's been fascinating for me learning about how all these different materials work. My experience with Iron Age objects has been very much from the metalworking side of things before this. So again, we're working in modern conditions, modern environments, trying to recreate an environment of 2,500 years ago as well. And I say that date because we know from radiocarbon dating the original shield that it was buried sometime between about 400 and 200 BC. You can maybe narrow this down a little bit, but we know that it was made and buried during that period. So now I'm going to move all the new organic materials away because I don't want anything that's in these to contaminate the original objects, which have been carefully treated by peg treatment and freeze drying to preserve them. So what I have here is the original boss from the bark shield. So this is the basket boss. The rest of the shield is currently in the conservation lab being prepared for display in the galleries. So if you look closely, you should be able to see it's got this general domed shape. It's a bit flattened on one side now. And that's where it's been in the ground, pressed in the ground. The weight of the soil above it seems to have distorted it a bit. And then we also have surviving some of the twisted cord lime bar stitches that again stitched through the boss, attaching it to the body of the shield. There's a couple of extra features which you won't see on the experimental shield. One is this hole in the middle here. And that hole, it's very dark around the edge of it. And the darkening is something that Barbara's been telling me occurs when the wood is exposed while it's in the ground. So we think that hole was already there when the shield went into the ground. And the little stone inside it has kind of worked its way in where it's been pressed in the ground. So it shows again that the shield's had some use, it's had some damage before it was buried. And then if I turn it around to the other side, you can see we're missing a little bit of the flange, the rim here. But you may be able to pick out a teeny tiny hole. And we've plucked from that hole the end of a little thorn. And Caroline Cartwright, who's been able to analyse the plant species of all the different elements of the shield, she's analysing that thorn for us to see if we can work out what that is. Now this makes me start thinking about how the shield's used. We've talked about how the shield is, used to protect you from blows, from spears, but it also might be used to break your way through undergrowth, sharp, bristly bushes, sharp thorns, and protect you from that. And perhaps that's how that little thorn got stuck in the boss there. But it gives you an idea of it being used. One other feature, another sort of dark area on the middle here, and this is where the foundation rods, so that wound willow, has been exposed, and it's blackened in colour. Now, it shouldn't be exposed when you're using it. It should be hidden by the stitches. So again, this is a sign of wear and tear. A little bit old, a little bit weary when it was buried, this shield, but perhaps very loved. And then the last features are less visible without looking really close. High definition photography brings this out well. And that's the actual stitches of the bast over the foundation rods. And very carefully you can start to pick out each individual stitch and see how it was joined together. And it's careful examination of that allowed Diedrich to create such an accurate recreation of the boss. So there's an expression you often taught in archaeology. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because you haven't found something doesn't mean it didn't exist. And this is one of those rare moments, the finding of this shield, where that absence is filled in. It's the only one we know of, the only one that we found. And yet, this one piece shows how much skill the person who made it had. They were skilled in using and working all these various materials. If you look at the boss, there's such fine, tight stitching. And to be able to attach this rim and know the right size of rim and hazel to use, when to harvest the willow bark. So all these combined elements and the skill with which they've been put together, I think shows that person must have made several of these. It wasn't a single one-off. It wasn't a practice piece. It was a well-rehearsed, well-practiced piece of construction. So perhaps more shields were made like this than were made out of metal or with metal components. In which case, somebody could have been churning out hundreds of these, or most people made themselves one. It would have been a technology that would have been far more familiar to the people 2,500 years ago than it is to us today. I think in our current climate, one of the most important lessons from this shield is just how fantastic organic materials are, how versatile, how strong they are. All the elements that are put together here and the strength from those, I think it's really great to see something so robust, so useful, that has survived such a long time, made entirely from organics. And that's coming from me, a metalwork specialist. Thank you for watching my Curator's Corner. There's loads of others on our YouTube channel. I'm particularly rather fascinated by one about a curious automaton. The original shield is going on display in Gallery 50 at the British Museum this summer. You'll be able to see it across the gallery. It's a little bit brown. It might not look very inviting at first, but go in close and you'll be able to see these details I've shown you. Or step back and admire the shiny Battersea shield. No, step forwards and look close at the organic Enderby Shield.